Hey guys, my name is Trevor Sullivan, and welcome back to the Stratus Grid video channel. I'm a solutions architect on the Stratus Grid team, and in this video, I wanted to share some information with you about a service known as Amazon EventBridge. Now, Amazon EventBridge is part of a suite of different services within the Amazon Web Services ecosystem that allows you to build serverless applications. Essentially, what the EventBridge service is it's a managed service that allows you to ingest events from your applications, and then you can route those events to various different services. Now, there's a lot of different messaging related services. We've talked about things like Amazon Simple Queuing Service or SQS. There's also Amazon Simple Notification Service or SNS that allows you to broadcast messages out to many different endpoints. But each of these services has certain features and certain limitations that make them suitable for different use cases. So it's really important to understand the Amazon EventBridge service and how it works so that you can compare and contrast that service with some of the other serverless messaging services in the AWS ecosystem and figure out what the best service for your specific use case is going to be. Now, we're going to start off by talking about an architecture diagram that shows the different components of an EventBridge architecture, but then we're actually going to go in and create an event bus and send a test event and take a look at how messages are actually routed to different services through the EventBridge service. So for starters, what we're going to do is take a look at the diagram, but before we do that, I'm going to just share a little bit of information about Stratus Grid. So Stratus Grid is an AWS Premier Consulting partner, and we offer a variety of different services like migration, modernization in the cloud, stabilization of your services, as well as cost optimization. So feel free to check out our website at stratusgrid.com. We also have an ISV product called Stratosphere. So Stratosphere is essentially a FinOps tool that helps you to identify cost optimization opportunities across your entire AWS organization. In fact, it's geared specifically at large enterprises and private equity firms to help you to analyze all of your different portfolio companies or child companies within your environment and really get a centralized view of your AWS spend as well as cost optimization opportunities. So if you're interested in checking out Stratosphere and running a proof of concept in your AWS environment, then just go out to our website at stratusgrid.com, go to Stratosphere, and then hit the book a demo link right here. Or you can just click on the Let's Talk button up here if you are interested in having us help out with consulting services in the cloud. So for starters, let's talk about this architecture diagram right over here to help you better understand visually how the EventBridge service works. So on the far left right over here, we've got a person that kind of represents some kind of application. This could be a web application that a user is interacting with. It could be a terminal-based application, like maybe a CLI tool or a terminal user interface tool that allows you to interact using, different keyboard commands and potentially even the mouse to issue commands to a terminal UI application. It really doesn't matter what kind of application it is, but basically that application is going to send certain important events. So like if a user subscribes to your service, right, they sign up to your service, if they maybe place an order with an online retail system, if they cancel an order, there's all these different types of important events that are occurring within your business applications that you may want to capture and actually send to other applications so that those other components are aware of the state change or status change within a particular service in your application portfolio. So essentially, the application will send an event into the Amazon EventBridge service, which is very easy to interact with using the APIs for EventBridge, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then each of those events ultimately gets routed to what's called an event bus. And in your AWS account, when you go to the EventBridge service, you can create custom event buses, but there's actually a default event bus that you can't delete as well. So there's just in every region in your AWS account, there's a default event bus, and you are more than welcome to send messages into that default event bus. However, other types of events are also emitted to your default event bus from other AWS services. So for example, if you stop or start an EC2 instance, things like that will get captured by the Amazon EventBridge service and routed to your default event bus. And then what you can do is take all of those events, whether they're AWS platform generated events or if they're custom events that your applications are actually sending in to the EventBridge service. And then what you can do is create something called EventBridge rules. And so the EventBridge rule is basically a set of criteria to determine a filter. So if an event passes or doesn't pass a particular filter that you can configure. And then the other thing that a rule does is determine what targets it has so that the event can be routed to that target. So when an event comes in, it gets routed to an event bus, and that's based on the event bus that the message was targeted at specifically, which we'll take a look at in the actual API itself. Then the event bus has a series of rules that are associated with that particular event bus specifically, and then each of those events that hits that event bus are going to be evaluated against all of the rules, and if the rules are enabled, and if the event passes the filter that is configured on that particular rule, then the targets are going to receive that event. So the EventBridge service will actually send that event out to the targets or rule targets that are configured for each of those rules. And each of these rules can actually have multiple targets as well, up to 5 targets on each rule that is configured in an event bus. And each event bus can actually have multiple rules associated with it as well, so that you can have different filtration criteria and then have different sets of targets for each of those criteria as well. And then as we just mentioned, you can also create custom event buses. So when you send an event, a custom event into the EventBridge service, you can specify the name of which event bus that you want an event to be routed to initially. And then based on which event bus receives that particular event, that's going to determine which rules are evaluated. And the rules, again, are associated with a specific event bus. So there's a binding kind of between the event bus and any rules that are configured on it. And then ultimately those rules have targets. And again, you can have multiple targets on each rule here as well. So one rule right here could actually target Amazon SQS, and it could also target an Amazon SNS topic at the same time, provided that the inbound event to that rule matches the filtration criteria for that particular event. So there's one API in particular that we're going to be taking a look at called the Put Events API, and that is the API that allows our application to send events into the EventBridge service and kick off this entire chain reaction here. Now, one of the things I wanted to point out is that EventBridge supports lots of different rule targets, right? So there's some of the services here. This is not a comprehensive list by any stretch, but some of the services that are supported as rule targets can be things like an Amazon SQS queue. So if a rule has a certain filtration criteria on it, and the message or event that's inbound passes that filtration criteria, then you can actually forward that event to an SQS queue. You can also target an Amazon SNS topic that allows you to do a one-to-many broadcast out to various endpoints like API endpoints or emails or text messages and that kind of thing. You can also do things like trigger an AWS step functions workflow. So if you need to do some kind of complex data processing on a particular event, then you can actually pass it through an entire step functions workflow that does various transformations and extractions of certain key fields from those inbound events. You can also do the same thing with AWS Lambda functions. You can actually take an event that is inbound from the EventBridge service, you can route it to an event bus, and one of your rules can actually have a rule target that forwards that event directly to a specific Lambda function instead of triggering a Lambda function as part of a step functions workflow. So if you just have one thing that you need to trigger, you could maybe just do directly to an AWS Lambda function. But if you have a more complex workflow that you need to execute, in that case, you might want to use a step functions workflow and then trigger Lambda functions from that workflow instead of just triggering a Lambda function directly from the EventBridge service. But the nice thing here is that you have a lot of flexibility about what targets you can configure on your EventBridge rules. So this is the high-level architecture of the Amazon EventBridge service as far as event buses go specifically here. And so what we're going to do is actually take a look in the AWS Management Console at how this actually works in practice. And then we'll send an inbound test event, and we'll take a look at how that event matches certain filters on the EventBridge rules that we have right here. And then ultimately, we want to see those messages or events get routed to the rule targets. All right, so what we're going to do is switch over to the AWS Management Console here. And we are going to just choose a region that works for us. So I'm going to be working in the northern Northern California US West 1 region here. And I'm going to go over to the EventBridge service. So you can just search for Bridge or EventBridge or whatever you want to. And if we head over to the Amazon EventBridge service, one of the options on the left-hand navigation area is going to be the event buses right here. And again, you're going to have a default event bus that shows up in every AWS region. So you can actually just send events directly into that default event bus. However, if you have a large environment that's shared with lots of different developers and different development teams, then you might actually want to create separate event buses for different application components so that applications are not inundated, or the event buses rather are not being inundated with lots of events from applications that are not really relevant to that particular event bus. So it's kind of up to you to determine how to architect a specific application and determine which applications are going to send to which event bus. But we do have the ability here to create custom named event buses in our AWS regions here. So to do that, all we have to do is click on the Create Event Bus button right here. We can specify a name. So I'll just call this Stratus Grid-Trevor-USW1. And then I'll just give it a description, like this is a sample event bus for a Stratus Grid video. And then you can also use an encryption key with the AWS KMS or Key Management Service. And then down here, you can set a resource-based policy that allows you to limit which applications can actually send events into this particular event bus. Event buses also support a feature called archiving, where you can create a sliding window of events that get captured, and then you can actually replay those archived events back into the event bus again. So that's kind of a nice feature that you can use to replay events that have already been sent to your event bus from another application. I'm also going to add a resource tag down here, just a set of key value pairs to indicate to my other colleagues who access this AWS account to see who specifically provisioned this particular resource. So then we'll just click on that Create button, and now we have a brand new event bus, and you can see it show up in the list of custom event buses here on the AWS Management Console. So if we drill into the details for that particular event bus, you can see that by default, we don't have any rules configured. So we created the custom event bus itself, but we have not yet associated any rules to forward to any targets. So what that means is that if we were to send input events into this event bus, they ultimately are not going to get put anywhere because there are no rules configured to match any filter criteria or set any targets as far as where those events should be routed to. So what we could do for starters is just say send events. And what I could do is just specify my event bus here. So I want to make sure I choose the event bus that I just created. We can choose an event source. So I'll just do stratusgrid.test. And then for the detail type here, I'll just say not applicable. And then for the event detail, this is basically a JSON payload that you can specify that will get forwarded as part of your event under the detail field. So for example, I could do something like first name is Trevor, and then last name is Sullivan, and then I could do title, and then say solutions architect, and then maybe company, and then set that to Stratus Grid. So I'll just copy that to my clipboard, and maybe I'll stick it here in Notepad so that I can reference that again if I need to. All right, so now I'll just click on the send button here to send that event, and what you're going to see happen is that some of these other fields automatically get filled in. So for example, this version field is just set to 0 by default by the platform. The ID here is set to a universal unique identifier, or UUID, also known as a globally unique identifier sometimes, or GUID. And that's just a unique identifier for that specific message that's being sent into the system. You can see that detail-type is set to not applicable because that's what I typed in to the previous form. the data source, this would be basically the application component, basically a way to uniquely identify that particular component and to distinguish it from other components within the system. I can also see that the AWS account ID, this was automatically populated based off of the AWS account ID that I'm currently logged into right here. Also, the time field here with the full timestamp, including the year, month, day, hour, minute, and second in universal time coordinates. That was also automatically set based on the current time. And then down here, my region was set based on the region that I'm currently operating in right here. And then finally down here, we've got this detail field, and you can see that the detail field is actually set to the JSON object that we passed in as part of the JSON payload. So that's basically what a sample event looks like right here. I'm also going to take that and copy it into my temporary clipboard right here, just in case I need to reference that for any reason. And it is useful to copy this because when we actually test out our rule filters, we can actually feed in a sample event like this one right here. So if we have a template event from the AWS Management Console here, when we go to actually test out a filter, we can just copy and paste this sample event into the AWS Management Console, and then we can test to determine if our filter is going to pass or fail this particular message. All right, so now that we've sent a test event here, it basically goes nowhere, right? So we sent an event into the event bus, but nothing actually happens, again, because we don't have any rules configured. However, if we went to monitoring down here, this has some built-in Amazon CloudWatch metrics that show you kind of the performance of your event bus right here. And as you can see, within the past several minutes, we have a single call out to the put events API, which is what your application would use to actually send a custom event into an EventBridge event bus. You can also see failed events right here. So if you tried to put an event onto the event bus and for some reason it failed, then you can see that right here. We also have latency. We have the request size. So it looks like I have an average request size of 142 bytes. I can also see successful invocation attempts. So this would be invocation of a rule target. So right now we don't have any rules, but if I did create a rule, and then I created some targets for that rule. So let's say maybe I create a rule that has a target of an Amazon SQS queue, then I should see a successful invocation of that rule target by the EventBridge rule. So let's go ahead and actually take a look at how to do that now. So at the moment, we sent an event in, but it went to a black hole. It just doesn't exist anywhere any longer. So what we can do is now go out and create a new rule. But before I actually create the rule itself, I need to have some kind of target when we get to the step number 3 right here. So what I'm going to do is open up another tab here with the SQS service. So if you search for queue or simple queuing or something like that, you should come up with the SQS service right here. And if I come over here to my SQS queues, I can go ahead and create a standard queue right here. And I'll just call this Stratus Grid -test -events. And we don't really need to change any of the configuration options for the message queue because the defaults should work perfectly fine. And then I'll just come down here and say create queue. Now, one of the things that you're going to have to notice with the message queue here is that in order for the EventBridge service to actually send events from EventBridge into the SQS service, we have to have an access policy that allows the EventBridge API, or EventBridge service, I should say, to send events into this message queue. So at the moment, we just have this statement here in the access policy, but when we actually create a rule using the AWS Management Console, that sends messages over to this SQS queue, we're actually going to see another policy statement get added to this list right here that will grant access to the EventBridge service to send events into the message queue. So now we'll come back to the EventBridge service here, and I'm just going to give this a name here. So let's call this something like Stratus Grid -test events -queue, and then I'll give it a description like sends events into Amazon SQS. And we're going to leave this enabled here. We don't want to disable the rule, otherwise it's not going to forward any events. And then we want to choose rule with an event pattern here. You can also create EventBridge rules that run on a cron expression on a schedule, but in this particular case, what we actually want to do is take these inbound events or these payloads that we have, similar to this one right here, and we want to evaluate each of these fields against certain criteria to determine if it's going to pass or be rejected by that particular filter. So what we're going to do is go into the next screen right here, and this is where we can build what's called the event pattern. And so what we can do here is specify which event source we have right here. So in this case, we're just going to choose other because we have custom events that are going to be coming into this event bus. And then right here is where we can paste in a sample event. So this is where I'm going to take this and copy it and then just paste it in right here and say enter my own and then paste that in. So now we have this JSON sample event right here. And then down here, this is where we can create the filter or what's called an event pattern. And so what we do here is we specify the values that we are expecting to see for certain fields. So one of the things that we could do, for example, is just check the source here and see if it's coming from the source stratusgrid.test. And if it is, then we can pass that through the filter or the pattern, I should say, and then ultimately the targets will receive that event from the EventBridge service. So let's go ahead and try that out just to do a simple match against stratusgrid.test on the source field right here. So what we're going to do down here is just create a new JSON object. I'll add the source field, and then the value has to be an array. So we'll do a JSON array, and then we'll just paste in stratusgrid.test. So then we'll hit next down here. And actually, if we go to previous here really quick, when we pasted in this event right here, what we can do is actually test it against this pattern right here. So let's just click on test pattern. And as you can see, it shows in green right here, sample event matched the event pattern. But if we were to change something like stratusgrid.test to something like stratusgrid.trevor, and then if we do test pattern, you're going to see the red here that says the sample event did not match the event pattern because we are checking for stratusgrid.test, not stratusgrid.trevor. So you can use this little thing right here to just test out the inbound events right here and make sure that the criteria or the filter pattern that you are defining is actually correctly matching. Now you can do things like what are called prefix matching here. So what we could do is insert a prefix match. Let's just do that really quick and say something like the source. And you have to do a little bit of manual formatting right here, but we'll say the source field should have a prefix of Stratus grid. Okay, so if we do that and test out the pattern, you can see that it still matches because the source prefix is Stratus grid, but now we could do stratusgrid.trevor, and that should also pass because as long as the prefix is always Stratus grid, then it doesn't matter what the remainder of the source field is. So that's a different way that you can use to just check the prefix rather than checking the entire string. And there are also things like suffix matching or checking multiple values or checking if it exists or doesn't exist. So feel free to play around with some of those different filters. All right, so we're going to hit next right here. And then we have the opportunity to specify our targets. So remember in our diagram right over here, each rule that we create that is bound to a specific event bus has the ability to specify 1 to 5 targets. And so in this case, we've already created an Amazon SQS queue where we want the event to be sent to, but we have not yet set the target. So that's what we're going to do now is set the SQS queue as a target of the rule that the message is being sent to. So what we'll do is say, all right, I'm going to choose an event or an AWS service rather. And down here, I'll say, let's search for SQS. We'll choose SQS queue. And then we have a drop-down list here that shows the list of SQS queues in the same region as the region that we're currently operating in, which is US West 1, Northern California. And then we can choose that specific queue here. So we'll choose stratusgrid-test events. And then sometimes there are some additional settings here as well. We could either say that we want to pass in the entire event, or we can actually do some basic transformation on the event to extract certain data fields and actually change the event before we send it over. But for now, I'm just going to choose matched events so that no data transformation is occurring in the inbound event. So whatever data that we get from the inbound event like this, I want this exact event to be sent over directly to the SQS service with no transformations. All right, so let's go ahead and hit next here. And I'll create a key here called owner with Trevor Sullivan as the value, just so that my teammates know that I created this rule here. So then we'll click on create rule. And if we choose the Stratus Grid Trevor USW1 event bus, you should now see that that rule does exist. So now how can we validate if the rule is actually working correctly or not? Well, we can do the same thing we did before, where we can send a sample event as input to the event bus, and then we can go over to the queue right over here and actually see if there's any messages on the queue or not. So if you go to the SQS queue, let's do a refresh here. And if we open up this message queue and then click on send and receive messages right here, if we scroll down a little bit, you can see we've got receive messages here, and we can click on poll for messages right here. And by default, it'll poll the SQS queue for about 30 seconds just to see if there's any messages. As you can see right now, there are no messages available on the queue. We can also click on edit poll settings right here and just change it to 999 seconds. So it just continuously polls for several minutes. So we'll just click on poll for messages, and down here under messages, we should see messages start to show up as we send input events to the event bus, and then they pass the filter in the rule, and then the rule has a target that's set to the SQS queue. All right, so let's go ahead and try that out. Over here in our event buses, we'll go to our event bus that's called Stratus Grid Trevor USW2. We'll click on send events. And then for the event source here, remember, we're looking for a prefix of Stratus Grid. So if I say Stratus Grid dot Trevor, and then for detail type, we'll say not applicable. And then I'll go ahead and just copy in this partial detail body right here, because we don't want the entire event. We just want this additional detail, and we'll paste that in right there, and then click on send. And as you can see, the event was sent successfully into our custom named event bus. So now all we need to do is tab over and check it out. We already have a message showing up in the queue here. So if we click on that message, we should see the message body, so the payload of that JSON object that was passed from the EventBridge service from a specific event bus that we custom created. And you can see that the rule has forwarded it to the SQS queue. Now remember that other types of targets are supported as well. So a single rule can actually target up to 5 different targets. So if we go back to the EventBridge service right here, and let's open up this custom event bus that we have right here, and then we'll go to the rule that we created and go to targets. It's called targets with an S at the end, not target, indicating that it's plural here. So what we'll do is click on the little edit button right here and say, all right, here's target number 1 that's sending to an SQS queue, but I actually want to add a second target. So I want to trigger some other service, like maybe I want to trigger a step functions state machine. And actually, before we do that really quick, I just wanted to go to the queue and show you the access policy here. And you should now see that there is a second statement here. So this statement right here allows the source ARN of this specific EventBridge rule to send messages into the queue. So if it weren't for that access policy, the EventBridge service would not have access to send messages from the event bus into the SQS queue. But when we created that EventBridge rule through the AWS Management Console, that policy statement automatically got added that does allow that EventBridge service to send to the SQS queue. All right, so back to what we were talking about here. Let's go over to the step functions service right here. So we'll open up the step functions service, and I'm just going to create kind of a dummy state machine here that doesn't really do anything useful. So what we can do is use the pass state right here, and that will just execute nothing, basically. It just kind of passes through the event and doesn't really do anything. And so what we'll just do is say inspect EventBridge event as the state name right there, and then we'll just click on create, confirm. And then once our new step functions workflow has been created right here, we should be able to go under executions and see a new execution of this state machine created when we send a message into the Amazon EventBridge event bus. So what we need to do is wire things up in the target. So we're going to come back to the EventBridge service here. And for target number 2, under the EventBridge rule, we're going to choose the step functions state machine option. And for the state machine, we're going to choose my state machine because I didn't give it any custom name here. And then we're just going to allow it to create a new execution role so that it can set up the permissions. And then again, there are some additional settings here if you want to do any kind of data transformation on the event or set up any kind of retry policy here for the events. But we'll just choose the defaults for now. Also, if I click on add target a few more times, you'll see it says up to 5 targets can be added. So after you get past 5, you won't be able to add any more targets. So let's remove those extraneous targets right here. And so now we should just have target 2 with step function state machine and target 1, which is sending to the SQSQ. So let's hit next, and we'll just update that rule with the new target that we just added. So now if we open up the targets, you should see that we've got the SQSQ and we have the step functions state machine here. So every time that we send a message into our custom event bus named, what is it called? I think Trevor USW1, this one right here, Stratus Grid Trevor USW1, every time that we send a message into that event, this one rule that we've created is going to be evaluated. And if it matches the pattern or the filter pattern that we have right here, if it passes that, then it'll get sent to both of these targets instead of just the SQSQ. So I'm going to come over to the SQSQ here, go to send and receive messages, and I'm going to pull for messages, and then just select the one message that we have in here, and I'm going to delete that message so that our queue should be empty. So now, if we restart polling here, we should see that that message queue is entirely empty. So now, what we're expecting is that when we send another test event into the event bus that we've created, we should see it go into the queue, and we should also see the same event trigger a step functions state machine workflow. So let's go back to our event bus right here. We'll click on send events. I'm going to put in an event source like Stratus Grid .trevor, and then for detail type, we'll say hello from Stratus Grid. And then for the event detail, I'll just paste in my little JSON payload right here, and then we'll click on send. All right, so now we've sent another event into our custom event bus, which is right here in our diagram. And we have a single rule that has 2 different targets, an SQSQ as well as a step functions workflow. So if we come back to the console right here and go to SQS, make sure we have selected the correct SQSQ right here. That's our target. Go to poll for messages. You can see that we have the message right here that says detail type is hello from Stratus Grid. The source is stratusgrid.trevor. So that all looks good. Let's go ahead and select that and delete it just to clean things up a little bit. And then if we come over to the step function state machine right here and go to the executions tab that we've configured as the target, we should see that an execution has been kicked off here. And if we open up that specific execution of the step function state machine and go down to events here, we can actually see the progression of that event through the entire step function state machine. So if we open up execution started right here, which is the very first step, you can see that the input payload from step function's perspective is the actual event that came from the Amazon EventBridge service right here. So that event was passed exactly as it appeared from EventBridge over into both the SQSQ as well as the step functions state machine. So in any case, that's kind of how we can set up the whole EventBridge service. We can create a custom event bus. We can create rules. We can create targets for those particular rules. And then we can set our criteria, our event pattern, to determine which of those events are going to get sent to our different targets based on that rule or not. So hopefully this video has been helpful to you. The one other thing I wanted to look at really quick is the API called Put Events. So if we just search for Put Events AWS on Google here, and then go out to the Put Events EventBridge documentation right here, Let me just fix the colors here really quick. This is the API that our application would actually be calling. It's a pretty simple API. All we have to do is specify an array of entries or events, individual events that we want to send to different event buses. So we can actually have our application send multiple events to different event buses as part of a single API call. So each of these entries in the array can specify a different event bus name, and that'll allow us to determine which event bus receives a particular event or not. Now, in this particular video, I'm not going to get into calling the put events API. I want to talk about that in another video where we're going to use the Rust SDK for the EventBridge service specifically to call the put events API. But for now, just understand that the put events API is what your application is generally going to be using, whether it's a Python app, a Node.js app, a Rust application, a Go application, a PowerShell application, whatever programming language or framework it is that you're using. The put events API is ultimately what you're going to call to put a custom event onto an Amazon EventBridge event bus. So hopefully in another video, we'll be able to take a look at that API and actually take a look at how to fill out some of these different fields and then send custom events from our applications. But until then, I hope you've enjoyed this video on Amazon EventBridge custom event buses. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Take care.